So in part one of the Wheel of Time and Gender little series, that's only a series because it ran too long, I give you a sense of the sort of critical milieu that Robert Jordan probably found himself in as he was starting to write The Wheel of Time, and gave you a little sense of the many ways he's explicitly trying to counter or address those critiques. And this time I want to talk a little bit about how he kind of messes it up in the execution. So way number one, and there are two ways, is that he seems really unable to escape the male gaze. And this is a term that's coming, I think, from film, where no matter how the subject is being shot, the person holding the camera is always a dude, right? And so usually this is sort of an exploitative view of a woman. And this seems to happen sort of across the board, unfortunately, with The Wheel of Time, right? Like, basically any character who gets introduced, any female character who gets introduced, gets discussed first, almost always, in terms of how they look. And this is the narrator doing it, P.S. And it feels a little gross, right? Like, it feels like all these characters are kind of trotting across stage, and Robert Jordan's sort of rating their hotness. And, yeah, it's uncomfortable, and goes a long way towards undermining the agency he's creating in them otherwise. It's pretty weird. So here's a possible counterpoint, which is that lots of the guys are described in terms of how they look. And this is true. I mean, for example, Rand is told over and over again that he's super pretty and has got like big shoulders and, you know, is a pretty hot dude, you know, and fair enough. But the difference I see here is that when it's a guy being described, it tends to be, I think, a woman describing him. When a woman's described, it's the narrator and the viewer. And so again, it's this kind of implicit view of women that the reader and the narrator and can't escape, and that just totally undercuts the badassness of these women. A weird little side part to this whole male gaze thing is that spanking seems to become a weird motif later on in the series. The scene I'm thinking of in particular is, and spoilers again, in case you haven't realized this is all going to be spoilers, is where Egwene is locked in the White Tower and she's a captive and she's being tortured, and it's supposed to be this kind of triumphant sequence where she's resisting torture and using the torture to her advantage and ends up gaining influence and ultimately becoming the Amerlin seat herself. And that kind of works. Like, it felt like a pretty good story arc, and a pretty satisfying story arc, except for the fact that the way she was being tortured is by being spanked a bunch of times. And what? Like, that's the best they can do? Like, that's all they got is spanking? They're not going to do anything. It just felt A, sort of unrealistic, and B, more importantly, weirdly erotic, to have these two women sort of spanking each other, like, oh, I'm going to punish you. And the weird thing is that it's not erotic to the characters, right? I mean, to Egwene and her torturer, you know, it's totally serious. But then to the reader, you know, it's like, oh, that's kind of hot, but it's not supposed to be, right? I mean, it's I don't know. It's, again, this kind of male gaze coming in, and Robert Jordan seems sort of totally oblivious to how erotic something like spanking can be. It's bizarre. Okay. So that's way number one. Way number two is that Robert Jordan can't seem to get over gender essentialism. And gender essentialism, in a nutshell, is basically when you sort of prescribe essential characteristics to masculinity and femininity, right? It means this concrete absolute thing to be a woman and this concrete absolute thing to be a man, and he's all about that, and maybe the yin yang symbol is indicative of this a little bit. The fact that the the black and the white are so concrete and absolute, and there's no shade of gray in there at all. The two don't overlap. My cat is sort of lurking behind the computer. You can't see her at all, but she's there. Invisible presence. Okay, so just to give you an example of how this actually plays out, men are sort of uniformly in the Wheel of Time sort of stubborn, oafish rascals, who mostly, unless they're villains, feel honor bound to protect women. Nearly all the main characters feel this way. And women, on the other hand, are always sort of imperious and shrewd and always totally mysterious to men. There's a real like battle of the sexes going on here that feels to me sort of adolescent. Like, I can imagine. I didn't notice this when I read it as a kid. When I read it as a I don't know, 7th grader or 9th grader, I was like, oh, women, man, I totally don't get them. Who knows what they're thinking, So on one hand, adolescent. On the other hand, kind of bullshitty and 1950s-y, right? It just rings weirdly and seems dramatically oversimplified, and ends up really kind of dumbing down a lot of the romantic relationships in this series, I think, because the men and women sort of uniformly can't escape these absolute gender roles or gender characteristics that Robert Jordan assigned them. Nearly all of the relationships play out in the same way, where the men and the women don't quite understand each other, and then they end up kind of muddling along through together, and it works out despite the oafishness of the man, and despite the kind of manipulations of the woman. And it's just they all just kind of follow a set pattern that feels tiresome to me. So in other words, the Wheel of Time kind of shoots itself in the foot on the gender front. On the one hand, he's setting up this whole world to explicitly engage with gender in what could be a really interesting way, and it's reading exactly like him addressing the concerns people had about Lord of the Rings, where, to borrow an observation from David Mitchell, the only interesting female character is Shelob, this giant spider, right? Maybe I might add to that, Eowyn's kind of an interesting female character, but interesting women characters in Lord of the Rings are pretty thin on the ground, and so Robert Jordan's just like, I'm gonna throw in 1,000 interesting female characters, and that'll just fix the problem, and it doesn't fix the problem. So ultimately, Robert Jordan builds this interesting set of gender roles and relationships and structures, with the magic differences in magic use, and male magic users being kind of shunned and feared, and then forgets to have the characters struggle with or rebel against or try to adapt to these interesting conventions. If we compare the Wheel of Time to something like Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, which also has a different set of gender dynamics than our own, in that book, the main character Genly is all about this, right? I mean, the whole character arc of the book is him trying to come to terms with this, and his relationship with Estervin is shaped by his sense of Estervin's gender, and he's changed by it, right? It's part of the plot impetus. There's a real gender character arc, it feels really integral. Whereas Robert Jordan sort of sets up the same kind of possible thematic machinery and then sort of falls prey to his own kind of sloppy, instinctual misogyny that just ends up undercutting the whole thing and makes it feeling tiresome, repetitive, and occasionally offensive. So, yeah, that sucks. For example, something like homosexuality could have been a really fascinating wrench in the cogs of this world that he's created, and it doesn't really come up until halfway through the series, and when it does, it's really dismissed offhand and never dealt with. There are no gay main characters, and it's just a missed opportunity, I think. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the Wheel of Time and Gender. Really fascinating failure, but sort of a failure in that respect. But there are other respects to talk about these books, and next time I think I'm going to spend an episode or two talking about the Wheel of Time versus Lord of the Rings, because as I've sort of hinted here, there are some really direct and interesting reversals going on that are worth discussing. Okay, thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you on the next episode. Okay, goodbye.